The airport buzzed with holiday travelers until a black teenager in a gray hoodie stepped into the first-class boarding lane. Conversations faded. Eyes followed him before a single word was spoken. A woman near the line leaned toward her husband. First class? He must be confused. The flight attendant looked up, forced a polite smile, then noticed the boarding pass in his hand. Sir, let me see that. He offered it without hesitation. She glanced once, frowned, then pulled it completely from his fingers. Where did you get this? I booked the flight. I asked where you got it. I already answered. Her voice sharpened. These seats aren't for jokes. If someone gave you this ticket, tell me now. Several passengers lifted their phones. A businessman whispered, This won't end well. Another traveler muttered, Security should already be here. The teenager looked around quietly. Every face seemed to carry a decision already made. I can explain, he said. There's nothing to explain, the attendant interrupted. This boarding pass doesn't match what I'm seeing. What exactly are you seeing? She hesitated only a second. I'm seeing someone who shouldn't be standing in this line. Silence settled over the gate. An older employee shifted uncomfortably, but stayed. Quiet, the teenager smiled, not proudly, not angrily, just calmly. The smile unsettled. Everyone more than an argument could have. The attendant folded her arms. You think this is funny? No. Then why are you smiling? Because truth usually arrives after assumptions. Nobody answered. More phones appeared above the crowd. Every camera captured the same moment. One uniform holding authority, one teenager standing with quiet dignity, and dozens of witnesses choosing silence over fairness. He extended his hand. Keep the ticket, he said softly. You'll need it more than I will. Somewhere beyond the gate, polished shoes echoed across the terminal, drawing steadily closer. The teenager's words lingered in the air long after he lowered his hand. No one reached for the boarding pass. The flight attendant held it tightly, convinced she had prevented a serious mistake. A woman whispered, He's acting too calm. Her friend nodded. People like him always have a story. The teenager heard every word but kept his eyes moving. Across the crowd instead of answering, a man wearing an expensive suit adjusted his watch and quietly stepped farther away. I don't want any trouble before my flight, he muttered. Another passenger shrugged. If he belongs here, he'll prove it. The sentence spread through the waiting area like permission. Two airport employees exchanged uneasy glances. Should we call security? One asked. They're already watching. Near the entrance, two officers stood still, speaking softly into their radios while keeping the teenager in sight. We'll wait, one officer said. Let's see where this goes. Neither of them asked a single question. The flight attendant folded the boarding pass neatly. Our passengers expect us to protect this airline, she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A coworker smiled. You're doing the right thing. She accepted the praise without hesitation. The teenager slowly looked from one face to another. Some looked curious, others looked satisfied. Many simply looked away. He quietly remembered his grandfather's words. When people stop seeing the person, they start believing the story they invented. His expression never changed. He wasn't studying accusations anymore. He was studying character. Every whisper, every lowered head, every person choosing comfort instead of fairness. Dozens of phones continued recording, yet nobody stepped between him and the growing humiliation. The silence became its own decision. The crowd believed the case was already settled. Then, somewhere beyond the terminal entrance, several dark vehicles rolled quietly to the curb. Unnoticed by everyone still convinced they already knew exactly who the teenager was. The dark vehicles had barely stopped outside when the boarding gate remained trapped inside its own assumptions. The flight attendant still held the boarding pass, refusing to loosen her. "Grip, you'll get this back after security." "Finishes," she said firmly. The teenager nodded once. "If that's what you believe." Her confidence drew quiet approval from several passengers. Finally, someone whispered, "She's handling it." He answered with nothing except the same calm smile. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't nervous. It simply refused to surrender. The smile unsettled the room. A businessman frowned. "Why does he look so relaxed?" "I don't know," another replied. "If I were innocent, I'd be angry." The teenager reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone. He tapped one contact. The call connected almost immediately. "I'm at gate 12, he said quietly. "Everything is proceeding exactly as expected." A brief pause. "Yes, sir?" "I'll wait." He ended the call. Less than 10 seconds. No explanation, no complaints, no threats. The silence afterward felt heavier than the conversation itself. Passengers exchanged uncertain looks. What did he mean by that? Who was he talking to? Even the people recording lowered their phones for a moment. The flight attendant forced another confident smile. "It doesn't matter who you called." "No," he replied gently. "It usually doesn't." For the first time, her expression hesitated, only for a second. Then she straightened her shoulders again. Across the terminal, quiet notifications appeared on several executive phones. One message, one location, an instruction. No alarm sounded. No announcement interrupted the travelers. Yet elevators opened. Done. Office doors closed. Important. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, several. Executives began walking. Together without speaking. Their polished shoes echoed. Softly across the terminal floor, a gate agent looked up from her computer as they approached. Her face suddenly lost its color. She reached for the airport phone with trembling fingers. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "The board has arrived." Every conversation stopped. Every confident whisper disappeared. Every conversation at gate 12 disappeared the moment the words reached the crowd. "The board has arrived." The teenager remained still, but his thoughts drifted far beyond the terminal. Long before polished boardrooms, luxury aircraft, and international routes, his grandfather had stood outside another airport where a black traveler was told to wait because others believed he did not belong. Instead of accepting humiliation, the young man carried home a different dream. He promised himself that one day he would build an airline where every passenger would receive dignity before status, wealth, or appearance. The beginning was painfully small. Banks rejected him. Investors laughed. Some businessmen refused to shake his hand. Others quietly admitted his race made the company too risky. Each rejection became another brick beneath the foundation of his determination. If doors remained closed, he would build his own entrance. Years passed. One aging aircraft became 3. 3 became 10 employees. Were trained with one simple rule: treat every passenger like family before you treat them like customers. When the founder finally retired, his son inherited more than an airline. He inherited a promise. The younger man expanded routes across continents, but avoided magazine covers and television interviews. He often reminded executives, the company should be recognized before the family behind it. Privacy became protection. The family traveled anonymously whenever possible, purchasing ordinary tickets, standing in regular lines, and quietly watching how employees behaved when no one believed leadership was nearby. Reports could be polished. Meetings could hide uncomfortable truths. Anonymous travel never lied. Many inspections brought pride. Flight. Attendants comforted frightened children. Gate. Agents patiently helped elderly passengers. Pilots delayed departures for struggling families. Yet other journeys uncovered something darker. Complaints disappeared inside. Management, promotion decisions quietly favored familiar faces. Respect sometimes depended on appearance instead of humanity. Inside his grandfather's old journal, one sentence had been underlined twice. Airplanes carry people. Character carries the company, the teenager remembered. Reading those words before every inspection, that was why he wore simple clothes instead of expensive. Suits, respect offered only after recognizing power was never respect at all. His family had never feared losing market share. They feared losing purpose, standing silently inside the crowded terminal, surrounded by whispers and suspicion. The teenager finally understood what the arriving board had already begun, realizing the humiliation unfolding at Gate 12 was not one employee's mistake, it was history quietly repeating itself inside the very airline built to ensure history would never repeat again. Realization settled heavily inside him as the terminal remained frozen. This moment had not appeared from nowhere. It had been growing quietly for years, hidden beneath polished uniforms, cheerful greetings, and advertisements promising every passenger an exceptional experience. The airline looked flawless from the outside, yet appearances had become better protected than principles. Inside headquarters, complaint files had arrived one after another. A passenger described being questioned 3 times while others walked through without interruption. An employee reported hearing coworkers joke about certain passengers belonging in economy regardless of their tickets. Each report received the same polite response. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Then the files disappeared into cabinets where nothing meaningful changed. Meetings were held, notes were written. Promises were made, accountability never arrived. The teenager remembered reading confidential reviews that revealed another painful pattern. Highly qualified minority. Employees repeatedly lost promotions to less experienced candidates. Official explanations always sounded professional. Not the right fit. Needs more leadership experience. We'll reconsider next year. Separated. Every decision seemed reasonable. Together, they revealed something impossible to ignore. Bias. Had learned to speak the language of policy. The damage rarely appeared through dramatic confrontations. It lived inside smaller moments. Extra questions. Longer. Stares, different tones, assumptions. Disguised as caution. Because each incident looked ordinary alone, few people recognized the larger picture forming around them. Managers often worried more about headlines than healing. When complaints threatened the company's reputation, quiet settlements replaced honest investigations. Difficult conversations stayed behind closed doors until they were forgotten. Protecting the airline's image slowly became more important than protecting the dignity of the people trusting it. Many employees noticed. Few spoke openly. During lunch breaks, whispered conversations filled break rooms. Did you see what happened yesterday? I did. Are you reporting it? A long silence usually answered first. I can't risk my job. Fear became another company language. Every ignored complaint quietly encouraged another. Every unanswered report convinced someone else that nothing would change. That invisible. Permission reached Gate 12 long before the teenager did. The flight. Attendant believed she was acting alone. She wasn't. She had inherited habits the system had quietly rewarded. Standing only a few steps away, several longtime employees lowered their eyes. They had witnessed similar moments before, though never under cameras. This time, the humiliation refused to stay hidden. Old records, forgotten conversations, and buried memories were already beginning to connect. The greatest threat facing the airline was no longer one employee's decision. It was years of silence stitched carefully into respected uniforms until prejudice looked ordinary enough that almost nobody questioned it anymore, except the family who had built the airline to end exactly that. As the truth about the airline's culture settled over the terminal, another process quietly began behind the scenes. Executive assistants unlocked archived complaint records that had not been reviewed for years. Dust-covered files were placed across conference tables, and every page reminded them that no complaint had ever been just paperwork. Every report belonged to someone who had carried humiliation home after trusting the airline with a journey. 1. File belonged to Dr. Marcus Ellis. He had arrived wearing a medical conference badge around his neck and holding a valid first-class boarding pass. Even so, employees questioned him repeatedly. "Sir, are you certain you're at the correct gate? May I see another form of identification?" Nearby passengers watched without speaking. By the time he finally boarded, respect had already been replaced by suspicion. Another file carried the name of Samuel Brooks, a retired Army veteran. His service medals rested inside his carry-on bag while an employee publicly insisted he had entered the wrong boarding lane. "I fought for this country," he had said. Quietly, "I understand, sir, but please step aside." No one asked about his service. No one questioned the assumption. One report described a young mother traveling alone with her little daughter, the child cried, while employees examined her boarding pass again and again. "This ticket doesn't look right." "It came directly from your website," she answered. She spent the rest of the flight comforting her frightened daughter instead of enjoying the journey they had saved months to afford. None of them shouted. None created scenes. Their dignity remained intact even while their peace disappeared. Each trusted the complaint process afterward. Each received carefully written responses, thanking them for their patience while investigations quietly faded into silence. Some employees never forgot those moments. During late shifts, names occasionally resurfaced in whispered conversations. "I still remember that doctor. I think about the veterans sometimes. We should have spoken." Now, as videos from Gate 12 spread across social media, those forgotten memories returned with painful clarity. Former passengers recognized familiar expressions, the same hesitation, the same assumptions, the same silence surrounding obvious unfairness. Comments flooded beneath the videos. "This happened to me 3 years ago. I thought I was the only one. They never answered my complaint." Separate stories suddenly connected into one undeniable pattern. Inside headquarters, executives stopped reading isolated reports. They started reading a history they had allowed themselves to overlook. Teenagers' experience was no longer viewed as one unfortunate incident. It had become the key that unlocked years of hidden voices, forcing the airline to face not only one painful mistake, but every silent decision that had protected appearances while real people quietly carried lasting wounds far beyond the boarding gate. The flood of forgotten stories reached beyond the airline's headquarters. As former passengers shared their experiences, one traveler sitting near Gate 12 quietly pressed the upload button before boarding. The video was short, unedited, and slightly shaky, but it showed something official reports never could. Within minutes, strangers across the country began watching the confrontation unfold exactly as it happened. Soon, another recording appeared, then another. Each phone had captured a different angle. One showed the flight attendant taking the boarding pass. Another focused on the teenager's calm expression. Third revealed passengers standing nearby without saying a single word. Together, the videos painted a fuller picture than any witness could describe alone. The internet reacted immediately. Some. Comments defended the airline, employees. Have to verify suspicious tickets. She was only doing her job. Others asked a different question. Why? Did suspicion come before verification? Would this have happened to someone dressed differently? The discussion spread far beyond travel pages. Civil rights groups shared the clips. Business leaders reposted them. Former. Airline employees quietly added their own memories beneath the growing thread. Viewers noticed something almost everyone at the gate had. Ignored. The teenager never argued. He never pulled his hand away. He never insulted anyone. Even after losing his boarding pass, his voice remained calm. With every replay, early assumptions began falling apart. Late that afternoon, investigative journalist Ethan Brooks watched the videos. From his newsroom, he paused the footage several times. "There is something familiar about him," he murmured. His editor looked over. "You know him?" "I don't think so, but I've seen that face." He searched old assignments stored in digital archives, corporate charity events, business conferences, foundation galas. Then one photograph appeared. Years earlier, a smiling teenager stood beside several senior airline executives during a scholarship ceremony organized by the company's family foundation. Ethan leaned closer. "It's him." His heartbeat quickened. Inside the airport, employees quietly checked their phones between boarding announcements. "Have you seen this? It's everywhere already. People are asking questions." The confident atmosphere surrounding the gate began fading. Some workers avoided looking at the flight attendant altogether. Others stood silently, replaying the videos themselves. She noticed the strange change, but misunderstood it. "They'll see I followed procedure," she insisted. Nobody answered. The silence felt different now, not supportive, uncertain. Outside the terminal, the approaching executives continued walking without slowing their pace. By the time they reached the security entrance, millions of viewers had already watched the confrontation. The boarding gate was no longer the only courtroom. Years of hidden silence had escaped into public view, and no carefully written statement could return it to the shadows before the truth finally stood waiting beside the arriving board members themselves. The officer adjusted his radio before speaking. "Sir, we'd appreciate your cooperation. Please step away from the boarding gate while we sort this out." The teenager looked at him for a moment, then nodded without resistance. He noticed the flight attendant standing behind the officers with folded arms, convinced the situation had finally been brought under control. Around them, passengers seemed relieved simply because someone wearing a badge had arrived. Another officer reached toward the boarding pass still clutched in the attendant's hand, but stopped when she quickly explained. "He tried to enter first class with this ticket. I secured it before he could cause any trouble." Without asking another question, the senior officer turned back toward the teenager. "Come with us, please." No one requested identification. No one scanned the ticket. Procedure quietly surrendered to assumption. As they began walking, an officer faced the waiting first-class passengers. "We apologize for the inconvenience, everyone. Boarding will resume shortly." Several travelers nodded with satisfaction. Not one apology reached the young man, calmly leaving the gate. He noticed the imbalance but showed no bitterness. Looking at the officer beside him, he spoke gently. "I'll walk." "You don't have to push." The sentence was so calm that the officer immediately lowered the hand he had unconsciously placed near the teenager's shoulder. "I wasn't going to," he replied quietly. "I know," the teenager answered with a faint smile. Behind them, dozens of phones continued recording. Some people lowered their eyes. Others pretended to check their boarding information. A mother pulled her son a little closer but kept watching. An elderly man sighed as though something about the scene felt deeply wrong. Though he still remained silent, The flight attendant watched the escort with growing confidence. "You see?" she whispered to a nearby coworker. "Security knows when something isn't right." Her coworker forced a small smile but said nothing. Inside his pocket, the younger officer's phone vibrated repeatedly with incoming notifications. Curious, he glanced at the screen for only a second. The same video they were living had already spread online. Thousands of comments appeared beneath it. He looked again at the teenager walking peacefully beside him. Nothing about him matched the danger everyone seemed to assume. A quiet doubt settled into his chest. But orders kept his feet moving. Ahead, polished shoes echoed across the terminal floor. The executives were only moments away, and the walk that looked like defeat was leading everyone toward the truth. The younger officer slowed his pace as polished black vehicles came to a silent stop outside the terminal's glass entrance. No flashing lights announced their arrival. No assistants hurried ahead to clear a path. The doors opened quietly, and several well-dressed executives stepped inside with measured confidence. Their calm presence somehow changed the air before most people even noticed them. Rather than rushing toward the boarding gate, the group stopped several yards away. "Let's watch first," the chairman said softly. Every board member remained silent. They observed the security officers, the nervous employees, the passengers holding their phones, and the young man standing with remarkable composure. No one interrupted. No one demanded explanations. They wanted the truth before anyone had time to rewrite it. Still unaware of who had arrived, the flight attendant straightened her uniform and addressed the officers proudly. "I protected the airline's property," she explained. "The ticket looked suspicious, and I couldn't risk letting someone abuse first-class privileges." "I followed my instincts." She expected approval. Instead, the executives exchanged quiet glances without speaking. The teenager noticed them immediately. For the briefest moment, his eyes met the chairman's, but he offered no greeting. No smile, no signal. He simply waited, allowing every decision already made to stand on its own. Nearby employees slowly recognized the familiar faces. "Is that the board?" one baggage supervisor whispered. "It can't be. They weren't scheduled today." Uneasy murmurs spread across the terminal. Earlier confidence faded into uncertainty as workers discreetly stepped aside, creating space without being asked. One executive ignored the flight attendant completely. Instead, she watched the crowd. She noticed who kept recording, who avoided eye contact, who seemed uncomfortable, who looked satisfied. Every reaction revealed something no internal report ever had. The chairman quietly folded his hands. "This is more revealing than any meeting," he murmured. The flight attendant finally sensed something changing. Why were coworkers suddenly avoiding her eyes? Why had security officers stopped looking so certain? Even the senior officer shifted his weight uneasily. Nothing had been said, yet confidence slowly began slipping away. One board member leaned toward the chairman. "Should we step in now?" He gently shook his head. "Not yet." Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked in a calm voice that carried farther than expected, "Has anyone told her who he's waiting for?" The question landed like a sudden silence. Several employees stared at one another. One security officer swallowed hard. The flight attendant frowned, confused. "What does that mean?" she asked. Nobody answered. The teenager remained exactly where he stood, hands relaxed, expression peaceful. Around him, whispers disappeared one by one. For the first time since the confrontation began, silence no longer protected assumptions. It protected the truth. And within that silence, the balance of power quietly changed before a single revelation had even been spoken aloud. The silence held for another long moment before the chairman finally stepped forward. He passed the station manager without a glance. He walked beyond the security officers, the supervisors, and every employee waiting anxiously for direction. His attention remained fixed on only one person standing quietly beside the boarding gate. The terminal seemed to stop, breathing. Passengers lowered their phones just enough to see what would happen next. When the chairman reached the teenager, he offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Carter," he said warmly. "We're deeply sorry to have kept you waiting." Another board member added softly, "We should have arrived sooner." The words echoed through the terminal. No one spoke. No one even shifted their feet. The silence became heavier than every accusation made during the past several minutes. People replayed every assumption they had accepted without question. Faces that once carried certainty now reflected disbelief. The flight attendant stared at the chairman, then at the teenager, then back again. Her lips parted as if searching for an explanation, but none came. I don't understand," she whispered. For the first time that morning, the confidence she had worn like part of her uniform completely disappeared. Authority no longer felt like protection. It felt frighteningly fragile. Around the gate, passengers instinctively turned their cameras away from the teenager. Every lens now focused on the board members, the shaken employees, and the woman whose certainty had quietly collapsed. The story had changed without anyone announcing it. The senior security officer slowly removed his hands from his duty belt. His younger partner looked toward the floor. "We escorted the wrong person," he murmured. The senior officer answered quietly, "No, we trusted the wrong assumption." Neither man attempted to defend what had happened. Nearby employees exchanged nervous glances before taking small steps backward. Nobody instructed them to move. They simply no longer wanted to stand beside the decisions they had silently supported only moments earlier. The flight attendant noticed the empty space growing around her. Coworkers who had nodded in agreement now avoided her eyes. She stood alone. Without anyone accusing her, Mr. Carter looked at the chairman. "You don't owe me an apology," he said calmly. "The problem began long before today." The chairman lowered his head respectfully. "Even so, you deserved better." Mr. Carter accepted the words with a simple nod. He showed no satisfaction, no anger, no desire to embarrass anyone. His restraint filled the terminal with quiet reflection stronger than any public celebration could have created. Everyone finally understood that the boarding pass had never been the real test. The true examination belonged to the airline itself, and with one name spoken aloud, every belief that had shaped the confrontation collapsed, leaving only truth standing where judgment had once been. The change happened so naturally that no one noticed the exact moment it began. The phones that had followed Mr. Carter with suspicion slowly turned toward the flight attendant instead. No one gave instructions. No one asked for a different angle. The crowd simply realized where the real story had always been. She stood frozen beneath dozens of quiet cameras. Not one person shouted. Not one passenger demanded punishment. The silence surrounding her carried more weight than angry words ever could. Every second stretched longer as she searched the faces around her, hoping someone would reassure her that she had acted correctly. No one did. Coworkers who had defended her judgment only minutes earlier now looked toward the floor or busied themselves with meaningless tasks. One supervisor quietly stepped aside, leaving a noticeable space between himself and the woman he had supported. The security officers remained motionless. The younger officer replayed the escort in his mind. "We never checked," he whispered. His partner answered with visible regret. "We believed confidence instead of evidence." Neither man tried to excuse what had happened. Across social media, the live stream continued, reaching thousands of new viewers every minute. The comments no longer argued about whether the teenager belonged in first class. Instead, People questioned why simple verification had been replaced by suspicion. A junior gate agent quietly watched everything unfold. "I've seen this before," she admitted to herself. "I just never said anything." The realization settled heavily inside her. She understood that staying silent had protected her position, but it had never protected innocent people. The flight attendant looked from face to face one last time. Managers avoided her eyes. Security stood. Quietly, even the passengers who had first applauded her actions now seemed uncomfortable. Mr. Carter said nothing, simply waited with the same calm dignity that had carried him through every accusation. Without another speech or confrontation, the entire terminal felt transformed. The cameras, the employees, the passengers, and even the silence itself had quietly chosen truth, proving that real accountability begins long before official consequences are ever announced. Mr. Carter allowed the silence to settle before taking a single step forward. No microphone was needed. No dramatic gesture followed. Every person in the terminal watched him differently now. Only minutes earlier, they had searched his face for guilt. Now they searched it for understanding. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of passengers, employees, security officers, and finally the flight attendant. "I never wanted special treatment," he said quietly. "I wanted honest treatment." His words reached every corner of the terminal. If respect only appears after someone learns your last name, then it isn't respect. It's fear. No one interrupted. The chairman folded his hands while the board listened without speaking. Mr. Carter continued. "For the last 4 years, I've traveled on our flights without introducing myself. Different cities, different routes, different uniforms. I wanted to experience this airline exactly as every customer experiences it." Several executives exchanged knowing glances. "We receive reports every month," he said. "Most describe excellent service. But anonymous travel tells a different story. Reports can be edited. Real moments cannot." He paused before looking toward the boarding gate. This isn't the first time someone was judged before being heard. The word struck harder than any accusation. "I've watched passengers questioned because of their appearance. I've spoken with employees who were afraid to report discrimination. I've seen policies promise dignity while daily. Habits quietly ignored those promises." The terminal remained completely still. "Our training manuals say every traveler deserves equal respect." He looked around the room, but manuals don't greet passengers. People do. Several employees lowered their heads. "I didn't come here hoping someone would fail," he continued. "I came hoping our values would succeed." The flight attendant struggled to hold back tears. "I believed I was protecting the airline," she whispered. Mr. Carter met her eyes without anger. "I believe you wanted to protect it." His voice remained gentle, but protecting a company should never mean humiliating a person before knowing the truth. "No." Reply came. The board members silently understood that months of anonymous inspections, forgotten complaints, and hidden reports had already formed a complete investigation. Today's incident had simply confirmed everything they feared. Mr. Carter drew a slow breath. "Real leadership isn't about catching people making mistakes," he said. "It's about creating a place where people choose fairness before they are forced to." The chairman nodded respectfully. Around the terminal, faces no longer reflected fear of consequences. They reflected hope that something long ignored could finally change. For the first time that morning, accountability no longer felt like punishment. It felt like the beginning of an airline becoming worthy of the mission on which it had been built. The chairman gave a quiet nod to the airline's legal director. "Bring every unresolved complaint file," he said. "Nothing stays locked away today." Within minutes, several managers returned carrying worn storage boxes and thick folders coated with dust. They placed them on a nearby conference table inside the terminal lounge, where passengers, employees, and board members could all see them. Each file represented someone who had trusted the airline enough to ask for fairness. The first folder was opened, then another, then another. Different dates, different airports, different names, yet the stories sounded painfully familiar. Passengers questioned because of their appearance. Employees overlooked despite years of outstanding work. Complaints marked resolved without meaningful investigation. No one could call it coincidence anymore. The chairman looked across the room. We invited several former passengers and employees here this morning, he announced. Some accepted. An elderly veteran stepped forward first, then the physician. Finally, a young mother holding the hand of the child who had once cried beside her at another boarding gate. None of them spoke with anger. The doctor cleared his throat. I wasn't asking for special treatment, he said. I only wanted the same trust everyone else received. The veteran nodded quietly. I served my country, he added. But that day, my uniform meant less than my skin. The young mother took a slow breath. My daughter still asks why they thought I stole our tickets. The room fell silent again. Then, another voice came from the back. Reported it years ago, a former employee whispered. I never heard back. Those 7 words settled heavily over everyone present. One after another, current employees found the courage to speak. Chantuaru saw passengers treated differently. I should have reported it. I stayed quiet because I needed my job. I thought someone else would say something. There, honesty carried no excuses, only regret. The legal director opened several archived emails. These investigations were delayed, another executive added. This complaint was closed without interviewing witnesses. Third file revealed recommendations that had never been implemented because leadership feared negative publicity. The board members exchanged disappointed looks. For years, protecting the airline's image had quietly become more important than protecting its people. The flight attendant stood, motionless. She had entered the day believing she alone was being judged. Now she understood. She had become part of a much larger story. Mr. Carter looked toward her before addressing everyone. This investigation isn't about finding one person to blame, he said. It's about understanding why good people accepted harmful habits. The chairman nodded. From this moment forward, every policy, every report, and every leader will be examined with the same honesty. The files remained open on the table. For the first time in years, forgotten voices were no longer hidden inside cabinets. They stood in the open, finally becoming impossible to ignore. The flight attendant stood motionless for several long seconds. Around her, the terminal remained unusually quiet. The unanswered questions, the opened policy manuals, and the presence of the board had stripped away every layer of confidence she had worn only minutes earlier. She swallowed hard before finally speaking. I believed I was protecting the airline. Her voice carried none of the certainty it once had. I saw a situation that looked unusual, and I acted before it became a problem. No one interrupted her. She glanced toward the chairman, then toward the teenager. I've been trained to stay alert. I thought I was following protocol. The chairman nodded once, then, let us understand together. His calm tone somehow felt heavier than anger. Which procedure instructed? You to remove a passenger's boarding pass before confirming his identity? She hesitated. I assumed. You assumed, he repeated gently. He opened the operations handbook resting on the nearby counter. Please show us where that assumption appears. She stepped closer, turning pages with trembling hands. Security officers, managers, and employees watched without speaking. The terminal felt less like an airport now and more like a room waiting for honesty. She searched through verification procedures. Nothing. She checked passenger conduct policies. Nothing. She flipped through customer service. Standards. Every section repeated the same expectation. Verify respectfully, protect dignity, avoid public embarrassment, not. One sentence defended what had happened. The handbook slowly closed in her hands. I can't find it, she whispered. The chairman answered quietly, because it was never there. Those words settled over the crowd. Several coworkers lowered their eyes. No one blamed her aloud. They simply recognized that the confidence they had admired had been built on something the company had never asked them to practice. The teenager remained exactly where he was. He showed no satisfaction, no smile, no desire to embarrass her. His expression carried only disappointment. I didn't come here hoping someone would fail, he said softly. I came hoping our values were stronger than our assumptions. She looked at him for the first time without defensiveness. I'm sorry. The apology came quietly, almost breaking apart before it reached him. He nodded. I believe you regret it. A brief silence followed, but regret alone won't protect the next passenger. Nobody argued. The chairman looked around the terminal, meeting the eyes of managers, security officers, and employees alike. This investigation is no longer about one decision, he said. It is about every decision that allowed this culture to survive. Heads slowly nodded throughout the crowd. The conversation had moved beyond one. Employees' defense, it had become a reckoning. For the entire institution, dramatic punishment was announced. None was necessary. The evidence, the policies, the witnesses, and the silence had already delivered the hardest judgment. For the first time that day, everyone understood that accountability was not about destroying one person's future. It was about rebuilding the values the airline had promised from the very beginning. The chairman stepped back, allowing the teenager to move forward. Every phone remained raised until he looked across the terminal and spoke with quiet sincerity. Please, put your phones down, one by one. The devices lowered. This moment doesn't need another person to become a public spectacle. The crowd obeyed without hesitation. He glanced toward the flight attendant before addressing everyone gathered around the gate. His words settled over the terminal more deeply than applause ever could. If we leave here focused on one employee, we'll miss the real problem. Systems don't change because one person is blamed. They change when everyone accepts responsibility. Several board members nodded. The teenager continued. Starting today, every discrimination complaint will be reviewed by an independent investigative team. He looked directly at the executives. No manager, including myself, will have the authority to quietly close those cases. The chairman answered first. Approved. Quiet murmur spread through the terminal. We're also changing how accountability works. He turned toward the employees. Professional skill alone will no longer determine promotions. Respect, fairness, and dignity will carry equal weight in every performance. Review. Many employees exchanged thoughtful glances. And anyone, passenger or employee, will be able to report discrimination anonymously. He paused. Briefly, speaking the truth should never cost someone a career. Several workers lowered their heads, remembering moments they had remained silent. Our anonymous inspections will continue. A faint smile crossed his face. You may see me in a hoodie again? Someday. A few nervous smiles appeared throughout the crowd, not because I'm looking for mistakes, but because leadership should experience this airline exactly the way our passengers He looked toward a large photograph of the company's founder displayed near the terminal entrance. My grandfather never wanted statues. His voice softened. He wanted opportunities. The board chairman nodded. In his honor, we're creating scholarships for young leaders who believe dignity matters more than status. Quiet applause began, then faded as the teenager gently raised one hand. There is one more thing. Everyone became still again. He faced the flight attendant. There will be consequences because accountability matters. She slowly nodded, accepting his words. But you will not be humiliated. Tears filled her eyes. Fear changes behavior for a moment. Reflection changes people. The terminal remained silent. Finally, he looked across the passengers, employees, security officers, and executives. Remember this. His voice never rose. Power exists to protect dignity, not decide who deserves it. No one spoke after that. The lesson needed no explanation. People simply stood together, carrying the weight of those words into their own thoughts. Outside, another aircraft taxied toward the runway. Inside, the airline had already begun a different journey. The next flight would leave on schedule, but something far more important had already departed from the terminal. The old culture built on assumptions. In its place stood a promise that respect would no longer depend on appearance, wealth, influence, or fear. From that day forward, dignity would become the standard every employee was expected to protect. Every passenger could confidently expect, and every future leader would be trusted to defend without exception. The weeks that followed felt strangely ordinary. Yet everyone sensed the airport had changed in ways no renovation could explain. Employees arrived wearing the same uniforms, but those uniforms no longer represented authority alone. They carried responsibility. Every greeting, every boarding pass, and every simple question now reminded staff that respect was something earned through daily choices, not printed inside a handbook. Training sessions also changed. Instead of rushing through slides and signatures, instructors invited honest conversations. Employees discussed unconscious bias, difficult situations, and the importance of slowing down before making assumptions. Real stories replaced polished presentations, and people listened with the attention those stories deserved. During lunch breaks, conversations sounded different. Whispered worries no longer hid behind closed doors. Workers openly shared experiences they had once been afraid to mention. Managers joined those discussions instead of avoiding them, proving that trust could grow when leaders listened before problems became public. Department supervisors began holding weekly meetings where employees could raise concerns without fear. Small issues received immediate attention instead of disappearing into forgotten reports. Everyone understood that preventing injustice was easier than repairing the damage after someone had already been hurt. New recruits soon heard about the boarding gate incident during orientation. Nobody tried to erase the company's mistake. Instead, trainers explained how one painful day had reshaped the airline's values. The story became a lesson about courage, accountability, and the danger of judging people before knowing the truth. Passengers noticed the difference before reading any announcement. Smiles felt genuine. Verification remained professional but respectful. Questions were asked with patience instead of suspicion, restoring confidence one interaction at a time. Employees also discovered that reporting unfair treatment no longer threatened their careers. Integrity became the standard everyone protected together. As flights departed from the familiar gates, many quietly remembered the teenager whose calm dignity transformed an entire culture. The airport looked exactly the same from the outside, but inside, every boarding gate carried a simple promise. Every passenger would be treated with fairness before assumptions ever had another chance to speak. The terminal gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. But another story was only beginning several miles away. Inside a quiet house, the former flight attendant placed her keys on the kitchen counter and stood still. There were no passengers watching, no coworkers nearby, and no uniform to hide behind. The silence waiting inside her home felt heavier than anything she had experienced at the airport. She wandered into the living room and looked at a shelf filled with plaques, service awards, and framed certificates collected over many years. They had once filled her with pride. Tonight they felt strangely distant. She picked up one award, stared at her smiling photograph beside it, then gently placed it back. Recognition suddenly meant very little when she could no longer recognize the person she had become. Hoping to escape her thoughts, she unlocked her phone and sent short messages to former coworkers. "Can we talk? I just need someone to listen." Minutes turned into hours. No replies came. The silence on the screen echoed the silence inside the house. She hesitated before calling her daughter. The call rang several times before reaching voicemail. "Hi." "It's Mom," she paused. "I know you probably need time. I just wanted to say I'm thinking about you." Her voice cracked. "I hope we can talk soon." She ended the call without another word. Standing before the hallway mirror, she studied her own reflection. For the first time, she stopped searching for excuses. She remembered the teenager's calm face, his respectful voice, and the mercy he had shown when he could have demanded. Humiliation in return. His kindness hurt more than anger ever could. She quietly asked herself a question she had avoided her entire career. When did I stop seeing people before seeing assumptions? No answer came. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful. No reporters waited near the driveway. No angry crowds gathered outside her door. The absence of revenge left her alone with something far more difficult to escape. Truth. She finally understood that the hardest judgment had never come from the board or the passengers. It came from looking honestly at herself. She knew rebuilding trust would not happen through apologies alone. It would require patience, humility, and choices made differently every single day. For the first time in years, reputation no longer seemed like something earned through perfect performance. It would have to be rebuilt through honest character. And that journey, she realized, had only just begun. Weeks after the reforms began, airline representatives started visiting people whose complaints had once disappeared into forgotten files. They did not arrive with cameras or press releases. They carried folders, listened carefully, and gave each person the time they should have received years earlier. The company had finally learned that healing begins by hearing voices it had once allowed itself to ignore. The chairman and several executives personally met with former passengers. There were no prepared speeches and no legal disclaimers. "We failed you," the chairman admitted during each meeting. "We're here to accept responsibility, not to explain it away." Those simple words carried more weight than any public announcement. Not every conversation ended the same way. Some people accepted the apology with quiet relief, believing genuine change deserved a chance. Others listened respectfully before saying they were not ready to forgive. No one argued with their decision. The airline understood that forgiveness could never become another expectation placed upon those who had already carried enough pain. One afternoon, the elderly veteran returned to the airport as an honored guest. Employees greeted him with sincere respect, thanking him for both his military service and his patience. He smiled gently. "I appreciate today," he said, "but I wish respect had found me years earlier." His words stayed with everyone standing nearby. Soon afterward, the young mother who had once defended her boarding pass while comforting her frightened child returned with her son. This time, the check-in process was calm and welcoming. As her little boy walked confidently toward the gate, she realized he no longer looked afraid of airports. That quiet smile meant more than any apology she had received. The respected doctor also accepted an invitation to meet the board. "I forgive you," he said, calmly, "but remember something. The room became still. My degree never made me worthy of respect. I already deserved it before anyone knew my profession." Several executives lowered their eyes, understanding the lesson. Employees who observed these meetings carried those stories back into their daily work. They finally saw how a few careless moments could leave scars lasting for years. Many privately promised themselves they would never again remain silent when fairness was threatened. The airline knew it could never erase the past. Some wounds would always remain, but every conversation, every apology, and every reform became another step toward protecting future passengers from carrying the same invisible burden. The remembered faces of those once overlooked were no longer hidden inside forgotten complaint files. They became part of every training session, every policy review, and every decision made throughout the company. Instead of serving as reminders of failure alone, they became lasting guides, ensuring the airline would measure its success not by awards or profits, but by the dignity every traveler experienced from the moment they entered the terminal until they safely reached home together. Months passed, and the changes inside the airline became impossible to ignore. Travelers noticed something unusual before seeing a single advertisement. Employees greeted people with patience, questions were asked respectfully, and every boarding gate reflected the values promised after that unforgettable day. Trust returned quietly because consistent actions spoke louder than carefully designed marketing campaigns ever could. The company also released public reports every quarter. They listed discrimination complaints, investigation results, policy updates, and lessons learned. Nothing was hidden behind polished language. When mistakes happened, they were acknowledged openly, along with the steps taken to correct them. Passengers began believing honesty was becoming the airline's strongest promise. Families, business travelers, and longtime customers slowly returned. They did not come because they had forgotten the past. They came because every new experience confirmed that meaningful change was happening. Fair treatment became something they expected instead of something they hoped for. Across the industry, executives from other airlines quietly studied the reforms. Independent investigations, anonymous reporting systems, and surprise executive inspections began appearing elsewhere. One difficult moment at a single boarding gate had inspired conversations far beyond one company, encouraging others to examine cultures they had rarely questioned before. Business analysts soon noticed another unexpected result. Customer confidence increased alongside transparency. Industry leaders realized that fairness was not only a moral responsibility, but also a practical advantage. Respect strengthened loyalty in ways expensive advertising campaigns never could. Reporters continued requesting interviews with the teenager whose calm courage had changed everything. Every invitation received the same polite reply: "Thank you, but I'll pass." Months later, one journalist finally asked why. He smiled gently. "The story was never about me. It was about what needed to change." Those words spread almost as widely as the original video. Employees repeated them during training sessions. Managers quoted them in meetings, and new recruits quietly remembered them while helping passengers through busy terminals. The boarding gates looked ordinary again, yet everyone understood they carried a different meaning now. Every respectful interaction honored a lesson learned through painful experience and quiet determination. The airline eventually became known for something greater than flawless service. People respected it because it admitted failures, corrected them with humility, and refused to hide uncomfortable truths. Its greatest achievement was never becoming perfect. It was proving that institutions earn lasting trust when they choose honesty over image, accountability over excuses, and human dignity over every assumption that once stood in its way together. Other companies continued watching, learning, adapting. And improving because one teenager's quiet example had shown an entire industry that courage, transparency, and consistent respect could reshape public confidence more effectively than expensive campaigns, impressive slogans, or carefully managed public relations ever. Several months later, the memory of that boarding gate remained vivid, not because of the confrontation itself, but because of what it revealed about people. Looking back, it became clear that the boarding pass had never been the true issue. It was only a small piece of paper. What it really represented was something far greater. Every person's right to be treated with dignity before appearance, wealth, race, or assumption entered the conversation. The journey that changed so many lives had begun long before the airplane ever left the runway. It started the moment one young man chose calm instead of anger, patience instead of revenge, and truth instead of pride. The miles flown that day would eventually be forgotten, but the lesson carried by everyone who witnessed it would travel much farther. His identity explained the outcome, yet it never justified the respect he received. That respect should have been offered from the very beginning. Whether someone owned the airline, cleaned its floors, served meals on board, or traveled with nothing more than a single suitcase, every person deserved the same welcome, the same fairness, and the same humanity. A familiar announcement echoed through the terminal. First-class passengers may now begin boarding. This time, the words sounded different. Employees smiled with quiet confidence. Passengers waited with patience. And every boarding pass was checked with courtesy instead of suspicion. The ordinary routine now carried extraordinary meaning. The teenager picked up his small travel bag and accepted his boarding pass. Without looking toward the crowd, he calmly walked toward the aircraft. He did not pause for cameras. He did not search for applause. He understood that the greatest victories are often the ones that never ask to be celebrated. As he passed through the gate, people slowly rose from their seats no one had asked them to stand. They stood because they had witnessed character. They stood because compassion had proven stronger than authority. They stood because dignity had quietly defeated prejudice. The silence surrounding the terminal no longer carried fear. It carried understanding. It reminded everyone present that silence can either protect injustice or honor truth, depending on the choices people make. Long after the headlines disappeared, one quiet decision continued shaping countless others. The teenager had left behind something far more valuable than a story. He had left an example showing that lasting justice is built through wisdom, humility, courage, and respect. The narrator's final words settled gently over the ending. Some people spend their lives demanding respect. Others change the world by quietly giving it first. Moments later, the aircraft lifted into the sky, growing smaller against the morning light. Its destination appeared on every passenger's ticket, but its greatest journey had never been toward another city. It had traveled somewhere far more important, into hearts willing to question assumptions, into workplaces ready to choose accountability, into lives prepared to protect another person's dignity before protecting pride. And because of that, the flight carried hope farther than any airplane ever could.